Barry, I remember when we first met, we served together on the worship team, right? I was on keys and you were playing acoustic guitar. You like music?
I love music, yes.
Yeah. How long were you on the team?
I think maybe 2 years.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you started to move into other levels of leadership, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. Also, I love having you in our small group. It's awesome. You and Sandy are just the best. And so thank you for being a part of our lives and for agreeing to this interview.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah. So, as you moved into higher levels of activity and leadership at Grace Church, we were talking one day and we talked a little bit about giving. Do you remember what your attitude was about giving at that point in your life?
At that particular point, it was not good. I had a background of really not knowing much of anything about giving. So I would say that my attitude towards it was both uninformed and leaning negative.
You were sitting through sermons, and often we talked about giving. What happened when you heard that?
Well, first of all, hearing Dan preach was wonderful because there were these great messages happening, and Dan preaches in a way that affects change in people. But at the same time, hearing anything being talked about giving would often trigger sort of this old message stuff. And so in certain circumstances, it was difficult to hear it in an accurate way.
So when you say triggered you to old messages, what are you talking about?
Well, I come from a background, I'm not a church person by my culture or my background, and the outside view of the church from the world at large is that the church is just a place that takes your money. I was having a conversation with another person that I knew, a friend of mine. I had mentioned that I was looking to go to Grace Church, and he said, "Oh, Grace," he said, "that's the money church." And so, of course, I'm like, what? What does that mean? But then I'd heard from someone else that the preaching was excellent and that there were really good things happening here. So my wife and I talked it over, and sort of even in the face of those mixed inputs, we decided to come, and then being here, of course, and hearing what Dan was preaching and what was happening from the stage and what was going on in this church in terms of how God was moving here and the things that it was doing both in the church and in the city. We saw all that happening. That became part of that picture, and it changed things. But we really didn't know what we didn't know when it came to giving specifically. We weren't clear on that. But it wasn't until I spoke to Dan specifically, because in that conversation I was able to bluntly address sort of these prejudices and these cynicisms, and the things he had to say to me just sort of completely flipped the whole view for me. And I'll never forget it. His point of view was so simple and powerful. He made a statement that he said, I would rather be living in a hovel on 4th Street and be able to give to God than to live in the best mansion in the city. I just had never heard an equation like that. And the thing that really just changed my heart completely is that I didn't realize that money, it had a value to me that extended beyond just that of material value. It was tied into my fears. It was tied into security issues. It was tied into all these things that were really, when I was honest with myself, they were earthly concerns. Generosity and what we do with our money has nothing to do with money. It has everything to do with whether or not we are willing to trust God with what God has given us. And then I realized when I kind of stepped back from it, it's like, well, this is not a money issue. This is a trust issue. It was about clinging to things that really were worldly of nature. Dan makes the comment that everything we have is from God. Everything. That's easy to forget. When you're working your way through life, you think that all these things I possess are the things I've earned. But they're in reality the things that God has been gracious enough to give us. And it changes everything.
Yeah.
You don't hold on so tight. And so that's what happened.
Yeah.
We talked it through and it changed us.
Yeah. So how did you act on it?
We began to look at what would be first fruit giving for us, which is a beautiful concept that if we're giving God our first and our best, that's how we should be looking at it. And we looked at what we knew was going to be a proper and appropriate starting point. I think that there's a sound baseline at 10%, and as your heart leads you, you go from there. But we saw that as our baseline, and it opened up aspects of our lives which we didn't know were closed up to that point. It was surprisingly easy.
Can you talk about what's different? Like, what have you let go of? What are those things that look completely different now?
I would say the main thing is I let go of fear, because to me, money always meant security. And that sense of freedom that you get when suddenly you don't have to feel like this huge tower of protection is necessary and that God sees after us. That was the biggest change. That's a life-changing thing.
Any final thoughts to just sum it up?
It's normal to be cynical about these things because our culture wants to paint the work of God in as bad a way as possible. And so even as we engage in the work of God and we are generous and we open our hearts, we're fighting against culture in order to do it. So all of our natural instincts are going to say, don't do this. But that's not God's plan for us. God's plan for us is for us to trust him, knowing that he's given us everything, and that in trusting him, we can actually see him working. And I do believe at the most basic level that generosity is just simply a necessary part of our growth as Christians and growing and trusting God.